I'm Bonnie Hamilton. I'm the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the Climate Reality Bay Area chapter. And it's wonderful to see all of you here bright and early on Saturday morning, and appreciate your taking some time this morning to join us to talk about how we can do more advocacy around our state legislators and taking state action. We're here today for our state policy advocacy training and action workshop, and we are hosting in collaboration with two of our sibling organizations, 350 Bay Area Action and Climate Action Now. Per custom, for all Climate Reality Bay Area events, we will open with an acknowledgement of the ancestral land we reside on. I reside in Solano County on the unceded land of the Wend people. The Wend people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries, and it has been their home for thousands of years. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. This acknowledgement was approved by the Yocha Dihi Tribal Council on July 23rd, 2019. I also want to recognize the Ohlone, Miwok, and other indigenous peoples whose ancestral lands we currently occupy in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. We're honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We'll be proceeding with our program in just a couple of minutes, but first I want to share a little bit about Climate Reality Project in the Bay Area chapter. The Climate Reality Project is an international nonprofit organization funded and chaired by former US Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore. Mr. Gore founded Climate Reality in 2006, shortly after the release of his award-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, with the mission to mobilize a global grassroots network of climate advocates. Today, the Climate Reality Project spans 170 countries with over 44,000 climate reality leaders around the world trained by Mr. Gore to speak truth to power about the climate crisis and its solutions. The Bay Area chapter is one of the earliest and largest regional chapters of the Climate Reality Project. We take Climate Reality's mission to the local level with over 1,500 members, catalyzing solutions to address the climate crisis and climate justice across 8 counties and the many towns and cities of the Bay Area. Our chapter's activities are anchored in the Climate Reality Project mission to educate and inform the public, to use a climate justice lens for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in all we do, and to mobilize a grassroots network of climate advocates to take action that will lead us to a cleaner, safer, more prosperous, and thriving future. With hundreds of local climate leaders trained by Mr. Gore and hundreds more committed community members, we're committed to take urgent action to adopt solutions to the crisis. We have local county teams or squads and chapter teams focusing on policy action, climate justice, alliances, education, youth, and young adult involvement, business engagement, as well as communications and coordinating events like this one today. Our goal is for the Bay Area and California to lead and serve as a compelling model of a regenerative future for the rest of the United States and the world. We invite you to learn more about our programs, teams, and many ways to engage in climate action by visiting our website at climaterealitybayarea.org. We would love to see you at any or all of our upcoming events, and so visit our events page on our website to learn more. I will actually put some of the upcoming events in the chat. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but there's a few coming up this coming week, as well as over the next month. Just a couple of notes. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Climate Reality Bay Area YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks. And also we ask that during the 350 Bay Area Action presentation, you hold your questions until the end, when we will have time for questions and answers, or put your questions in the chat and we'll try to keep track of them. So let's proceed to our program. We will later hear about our Climate Reality Bay Area endorsed state climate bills, then hear from Tim Guinea, president of Climate Action Now, about the CAN app, and then we will take action. But first, we'll hear from members of 350 Bay Area Action legislative team, including Mary Ruth Gross, who is also our Climate Reality Bay Area Membership Engagement Team Chair, as well as Kathy, Valerie, and Ralph on how state legislation sausage is made and how to advocate for climate policy in California. Okay, take it away, Mary Ruth and team.
Okay, Ralph, so start sharing the screen. Oops.
Sorry, right in the middle. There we go.
That's all right. Just to start with, welcome everybody. It's really exciting for us that more people are interested in doing legislative work, really digging into the state. And our climate moment has done a terrific job with what we have on a federal level. And I'm so glad that they're going to be digging deep into the state legislative process. Next. So the 350 Bay Area Action, what do? We have two main divisions. One is the Legislative Committee, where we research research bills and make sure that the climate justice is at the top of the political agenda and climate change. And we have an Electoral Accountability Committee, and we help and elect climate champions, we endorse them, and we lobby, well, mostly on the Legislative Committee side. Now, just so you know, 350 Bay Area Action is a nonprofit, but it's not a tax deductible nonprofit. It's a 501c4. Our sister, our twin, basically, is 350 Bay Area. And that is a 501c3, which Climate Reality is also a 501c3. But we work very closely in collaboration. But if you see some things from 350 Bay Area and 350 Bay Area Action, we're completely on the same page. It's just there are some gray areas in terms of lobbying that really 501c3s, charitable organizations, can't do. So that's why we set up, and certainly you can't endorse candidates. So that's why we set up the 501c4, which does allow us to do that. Next. Basically on the legislative side, that we have three circles of what we do. So building relationships with legislators, we meet with them, we educate them in writing and in person and with demonstrations, we lobby them. We identify, a big chunk of our work is we identify and track different bills. And so that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. And then we also have, we educate and mobilize the public. We work in partnership with a lot of other climate organizations. And I'm going to turn it over to Ralph, who is going to talk to us, give us a brief overview.
Yes, this just as a brief overview. First, I'd like to remind everyone that everyone who works for 350 Bay Area and Bay Area Action, particularly on the Bay Area Action side, we're all volunteers. So I think on the Bay Area side, we do hire some consultants who help file when we're parties to cases, but basically we're all volunteers. So I want to just give you a brief overview of some of the types of legislation that we focused on in the past and a couple examples of larger bills that we focused on in the current session. So first, in the past, a couple of the major pieces of legislation that we've helped support and help get passed. Way back in 2006, some of you may remember AB 32, which was the Global Warming Solutions Act that was passed by California, the first one of its nature in the country. It established a policy to reduce our GHG emissions in the state back to 1990 levels by 2020. And based on what I've read, the state actually met that goal 4 years ahead of time. That represented a 30% reduction in statewide emissions from 1990. And actually building upon that, not mentioned here, but building upon, well, it is mentioned, SB 32 is a reference to legislation that was passed in 16 that actually builds upon the initial goal from AB 32. In 16, there was Governor Brown issued an executive order, which was later codified as a law as SB 32, that established the goal of 40% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, excuse me, 40% below 1990 by 2030. So that's been updated. One of the other things established by AB 32 back in 06 was the authority to establish a cap and trade program, which was finally put in place, I think, in 2010. And part of the cap and trade program, which is what allows emitters of emissions to trade their credits that other people are offering into the market to help meet their reductions. And they pay for those credits that they get through cap and trade goes into a program called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which produces anywhere from $1 to $3 billion a year. More recently, the last few years, it's been closer to $1 billion. Those are a lot of the funds that help implement a lot of the policies in the state that have since been passed and implemented by the Energy Commission and by the California Air Resources Board to help reduce emissions, whether it's transportation related, clean energy, eliminate fossil fuels, et cetera. And then in 2015, another major bill passed, SB 185, required CalPERS and CalSTRS to divest itself from coal, investments in coal plants and coal as a resource. I actually noted as of March 21, CalPERS was still holding about $8 million in 3 remaining coal thermal plants. I read. Hopefully they've addressed that since March of 21. And then finally, another major piece of legislation in 2018 was SB 100, which establishes a goal of 100% clean electricity by 2045. And that's 100% renewable and zero carbon resources, supplying 100% of all electric retail sales to end-use customers, and that's by 2045. And of course, there's been some effort and movements by others since 18 to try and move that goal even up quicker. And then quickly, a couple bills in this current session, we've been focusing on large bills. SB 1173 unfortunately died in committee. That would have required CalPERS and CalSTRS to divest itself from fossil fuel investments. Lots of opposition on that bill, particularly from CalPERS and CalSTRS, actually. We expect that a bill of a similar nature like this to come back in next session. So we'll continue our efforts in that regard. And one other quick bill would be SB 260, which is a bill in the current session, still alive, which will require corporate reporting of GHG emissions to make it more transparent for all corporations. I think it's 1 billion, making more than $1 billion have to report their emissions in this, their emissions from their company had to report that in California. And then the 350 Bay Area Action is set up with action teams that help us focus on specific bills. 3 of the teams, we have eliminating fossil fuels, which focuses on extraction of fossil fuels, shipping process, and the whole supply chain in the influence that dollars have from the oil and gas industry. And we try to hold fossil fuel companies responsible. So that's one bucket of bills that we focus on. Another one is clean transportation. Transportation is actually the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in California. So clean transportation team focuses on bills that are addressing transportation land use issues, electrification of transportation, cars, buses, And also more, particularly important is focusing on infrastructure. It's one thing to establish goals to get electric vehicles and other zero emission vehicles produced, but we need to have the infrastructure in place to make sure people using those vehicles have access to the source of electricity in order for their vehicles. And another action team is the clean energy team, which is the one that I actually chair. And we focus on clean energy sources, particularly focus on distributed energy resources, which refers to microgrids and rooftop solar, for example. Also focus on conservation, energy efficiency, storage, which is an extremely important complement with PV rooftop solar in larger solar projects like community solar and even utility scale solar. Battery storage is an important complement and aspect with regard to solar energy and wind, of course. And as Mary Ruth indicated earlier, we look at all of our bills, we look at everything through a lens of equity and making sure that disadvantaged communities in other folks who have less access to a lot of the renewable energy projects, make sure those folks in those communities are included. As many of us know, a lot of the fossil fuel industry infrastructure, whether it's refineries or pipelines, a lot of that tends to be associated or located in areas where disadvantaged communities and individuals live. And with that, that's an overview of that and our action teams. So I'll pass it to Kathy to briefly mention where the scope of our activities. Kathy?
Hi, so we cover the Bay Area. We primarily are working right now in the North Bay, East Bay, and San Francisco. And we work in conjunction with 350 Silicon Valley, South Bay, and the Peninsula. And we're talking to them now about possibly combining forces. So this is a huge area. We're covers 7.8 million people. There's a lot of diversity. We've got really dense urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas. And lots of times they have different people or different interests. County and district lines also don't match up. So it's very important when you're doing the legislative work that you know who your assembly person is and who your state senator is. And if you don't know that, you can go to a site called findyourrep.legislature.ca.gov and put in your address and they will tell you. Okay, Ralph.
Yes, and I should mention before I get into how we choose bills and how we do research on bills, with regard to the action teams that I mentioned, we actually have two other action teams. One is a communications team, which Mary Ruth will talk about a little later. And the other team we have is a federal team that focuses on our federal delegation representatives and also federal legislation, et cetera. But for purposes of this discussion today, I focus the discussion specific on our other three action teams. So let's talk a little bit about how the action teams, how the action teams choose bills, and then how the members of each action team actually do the research on those bills. So first, how do we choose? Remember, we have three action teams, and each of those teams are going to be busy figuring out which bills they want to recommend to the what we call our bill policy team for a sign off on that bill or bills being the final group of bills that we have chosen to push through through that particular session. So each action team is actually doing this. So one of the principal tools we use is what's called LegInfo. It's a legislative website that you can go to. It has it itself provides you links to other resources related to the legislature that you will be using if you're participating in this activity, you'll be using quite a bit. So it's called LegInfo, and it's where you go to find bills, to research bills, it provides the text of the bill, it provides the vote history on the bill, it provides updates on how it's being amended as it goes through the process, committee review. It provides you links to go to the assembly website or the Senate website, which is where you go to find the committees, the various committees. The Ledge Info gives you links to show you where the bills have been assigned, which committee they get assigned to, so that you know where to go to look for committee meetings when your bill is going to be coming up for hearing. So Ledge Info is a very important site. One of the other things we determined for choosing bills, sometimes there's what's called two-year bills. Each session is a two-year session. In this year, we're in the second year of a two-year session, 21-22. Next year, 23, will be the first year of the 23-24 general session. So sometimes there's bills that get introduced in the first year of a two-year session, and for a variety, any number of reasons, the author may choose either the bill is getting a little opposition, it's moving through its review through committees, but at some point during the process in the summer, the author may feel there's more opposition than I anticipated, and I'm gonna need to work on this bill a little more, so let's just let it sit and we'll come back to it. I've gotten it far enough along, maybe something I need to let the leadership know about, but I'm gonna let this bill sit and I'll come back to it next year since I'm in the first year of a two-year session. That's what's referred to as a two-year bill. So next year that author will come back and pick up where it left off. It won't have to start over again in the second year of that two-year session. If it leaves at the first year, it can pick back up the second year at wherever it stopped and pick up and save a little time. So sometimes it's a strategy with regard to that. Sometimes you're just trying to save a bill from losing it and come back next year while you work on it between the 2 years. So that's what a two-year bill is. We also contact 350 Bay Area Action works in Bay Area, works with lots of statewide groups elsewhere in the state that we constantly working with on bills and getting input from and suggestions and comments and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of partners and allied groups that we work with. We've mentioned a couple here, Climate Center, Vision in southern part of the state, and there's lots of other 350 type groups that are focused in specific counties or regions that we interact with and have statewide calls with periodically. Green California, and of course, National Resources Defense Council and Sierra Club are two of the larger groups that we always act with. And as you do this kind of work, you also establish relationships with the legislators, their staff members, and the partners. And sometimes between sessions, you'll be talking with your partners, and they'll be hearing from legislators, and you'll be getting suggestions for bills. You'll get a heads up that so-and-so is going to be introducing a bill. So you put that on your radar and wait for it to show up and see if that's something that you want to recommend internally as a bill that Bay Area Action may want to adopt as a bill it wants to support. So there's a variety of reasons. Sometimes it seems kind of random and informal, but January and February during a year of a session tends to be somewhat hectic on the part of action teams, because you got your trackers, everyone's listening, and you're going to Ledge Info, doing searches on Ledge Info, either by author's name or by subject area to see what's January, February, lots of bills are being introduced. Any given year, a couple thousand bills are introduced at least. So there's lots, so you can do searches by subject matter. That helps a little bit. But once you've done that research, then the action teams come up with this is all during January and February. Usually by the end of February, near the end of February, the action teams have got a list and may have already been talking to what we call our bill policy team, giving them heads up or sending some bills up the chain of command to get signed off on to adopt as an action team bill. But once we go, each of the action teams come up with a bill, with a group of bills, ultimately by the end of February, that it wants to recommend as an action team bill, it wants to support through the session. And those are programs and initiatives that target climate actions and are helping support Bay Area legislators that have established a good, strong record for supporting climate change action. So by the end of February, we usually have a big meeting with the Bill Policy Committee, which is comprised of action teams and leadership on the Bay Area Action side and individuals on the Bay Area side that are working in the same areas of clean energy or transportation or fossil fuels. And then we have a meeting where we usually try to keep our total bills somewhere around 20 bills. And each team has 4, 5, 6 trackers, and 20. This year we ended up with 30 bills. So that's the process, how we choose bills. So again, by the end of February is where we have that, and that list is pretty set. We're constantly getting, through the course of the session, you'll get requests from other partners and allies. Hey, here's a bill we want you to sign on to. So sometimes we'll have bills from other groups that we like, but we may already have our list of 30 bills. So in which case we'll decide, well, we'll sign on to that group's letter of support, and that way we're supporting that bill, but we're not assigning a full capacity from our end to that bill, because we've got our list of bills and we only do so much with the number of people we have working on the bills. So sometimes we'll sign on to a letter of support from another partner for a bill that we can't plug into our list, but we still want to support. So that's pretty much the process for choosing bills. So how we research those bills is we keep in touch with our partner and ally groups for insight and plans along the process. Remember, bills get assigned to at least one policy committee for review once they've been introduced and they've been assigned to a committee. Sometimes they have to go through 2 policy committees for review. Time can be tight for there's lots of bills, getting assigned to committees for review. So sometimes, and there's a time period within which Valerie will share the timeline in terms of how bills have to move. But you keep in touch with your partner allies, and you keep in touch with the author. You keep in, the bill, we have tracker, each action team's tracker is assigned 1 bill. And sometimes they'll get 2, depending upon their experience and how much time they have to spend. So that tracker is responsible for keeping in touch with the author's office. You try to get in touch with the staffer who's responsible for that bill, and to help you keep track of how the bill's moving. You also go into Ledge Info, constantly checking the committee hearings and finding out when your hearing dates are. You want to find out through Ledge Info, you can determine who's sponsoring the bill, who's opposing it, through various, the author's office always produces a fact sheet for the bill. And then in the committees that's reviewing the bill, always produces a bill analysis prior to the committee hearing date, which is always a source of good info. So you want to ask the author's office for the fact sheet, because that would give you a broad overview what the bill's doing, and also have a list of supporters in opposition sometimes. And then, as I said, the committee produces a bill analysis sheet prior to the hearing date. And then as the committee review process continues, you'll want to see who's voting for it, who's not voting for it, and always want to watch for amendments as the bill is moving through committee, because bills do get amended, and sometimes you'll choose to support a bill. It gets amended, like I like to say, it gets amended to death. It may make that bill a shell of itself, and you may end up choosing to pull support from it because it no longer meets the goals that you want it to meet. Sometimes the amendments are okay to keep the bill alive. So that's how we choose the bills. And then once we've chosen our bills, this is how we do our research. Keeping in touch with the author's office is extremely important in establishing that relationship with a staff person in that office. Usually a staff person is always assigned to a particular bill within that author's office. And then just constantly keeping in touch. And action teams usually meet weekly. Sometimes they take off time depending upon what's going on, but action teams keep in touch with their trackers. The action team leads keep in touch with their trackers through meetings and to make sure everyone's on top. Some trackers, if you got a lot of experience, they understand the process. Sometimes you help the trackers along if they're a first-year tracker as they get comfortable with the process. So I think that pretty much handles how we choose bills and how we research bills. So Kathy, you want to talk a little bit about how we support and oppose bills?
Yeah. So one thing, as Ralph mentioned, is we do keep in touch with the bill sponsors and the authors, because they can keep you updated as far as amendments and also where the bill's heading next, and prospects and sometimes people to focus on. And then we do direct lobbying with our legislatures in the Bay Area. So we set up the meetings with the staff and we will, do that sometimes by email. We'll set up meetings also by calling them. We like to meet with with the legislatures a couple times a year, once in the earlier spring, and now right about now where we're entering in the final push. We also work with partners, so we are on a lot of calls with different groups to see what they're doing. And then we generate calls. We have postcards. We can email. We have an extensive email list. I think we have about 19,000 people on that in the Bay Area, and we can target those emails now to say, hey, you need to call your legislature today to get this bill out of committee or to get a floor vote. We also attend hearings. Often these are just little Me Too things where you don't really get a chance to testify much as you can just get up and say 350 Bay Area supports this bill. One thing that's very interesting about the hearings is you really see who's supporting it and who's opposed to it too, which is often just as important. And frequently when you meet with legislatures, they will ask you, well, who opposes this bill and why do they oppose it? So that's very important too. Want to go to the next slide, Ralph? So the legislature in California, we have 40 senators, 80 assembly members. Each Senate district's divided into 2 assembly districts. And the Democrats have a supermajority in both houses, which, for a lot of people think, oh, Bay Area, supermajority, all of our legislators are going to be in favor of all our bills. And that's not true. Just because somebody is a legislator in the Bay Area does not mean that they're progressive. And there are certainly legislators that we try to work with who are not particularly environmentally oriented. So it's a very diverse legislator. This is one reason I think why before we meet with legislators, we do some research on them and what they support and who their backers are. And, so going into a meeting, sort of where they're coming from. Valerie's going to talk a little bit about how this process works. Valerie, you're muted. Still muted.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Oh.
Very softly, very poorly, but I could just hear you then.
All right, how about that?
Sounds like you're on a transatlantic cable, but we can hear you.
How about that?
Yes,
Ah,
yes.
Sorry, guys. My computer sometimes switches from the monitor to the internal computer, and I have no idea why. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so let me start by saying this is a super high level review of the bill passage process. So when a bill is introduced, know that ideas for bills can come from anywhere. And I know that annually I get a request from my state assembly person, Rebecca Bauer-Kahn, to ask for ideas. And she has used ideas from constituents to, launch bills. So bills can be either introduced in the Assembly or the Senate. And once a bill is introduced, no action can be taken for 30 days. Now, this is actually helpful because it gives you time to regroup, figure out whether you're going to, support or oppose a bill. It gives you time to get information. After 30 days, bills are referred by the Rules Committee, the Assembly or the Senate Rules Committee, to policy committees. Ralph touched on this. And of course, the committee depends on the nature of the bill. The Assembly has different names for committees than the Senate. So you have to look them up. It's easy, but for example, Senate Policy Committees, Environmental Quality, Natural Resources and Water. Assembly, Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials. And as Ralph noted, If you go to CalLeg Info, it'll tell you the committee. Now, one of the problems with CalLeg Info is it's always a little delayed. So if you're really curious, call up the author's office to find out where a bill is going to be referred. Bills can be referred to one or more committees. And here's the important point. You have to watch closely to find out when the bill is actually scheduled for a hearing. When is a hearing date? Because that's when the clock starts ticking, because the period before the hearing date is super active. This is when you submit your letters of support or opposition. This is when you contact legislators to get clarity. This is where you identify your coalitions and you prepare your strategy for the day of the hearing. When you're preparing a strategy, if you're working in a coalition, that is incredibly helpful. On the day of the hearing, those supporting the bill and those opposing the bill will choose a few key witnesses to speak. So once the key witnesses finish their presentation, that's when there's the opportunity for public comment. And generally, they've reverted back to this. Public comment is used to be limited to people who are attending the hearing in person. During COVID, this was definitely expanded, but they've gone back. So the Senate will still allow people to call in and state, their support or opposition. The Assembly now varies, and it varies by the chair of the committee, whether or not public comment is allowed by teleconferencing. If the bill passes the committee, the policy committees, it then goes to the Senate or Assembly Appropriations Committee. Appropriations analyzes the fiscal impact of the bill. Bluntly, the appropriations process is Byzantine and it's private. If bills are expected to have a fiscal impact or a state cost over a certain threshold, they are supposed to be put into what's called a suspense file. So they can be, and the idea behind a suspense file is that all bills that cost a certain amount will be evaluated together. So there's that budget, a fiduciary sense of responsibility. It's also a great opportunity to have a bill die because a lot of the discussion during the suspense, it's private. So there's a great article, if people are interested, we can share afterwards on bills dying in suspense. If a bill gets through all committees, it's referred to the House of Origin for a vote. And by the way, if you're looking in CalLeg Info, it'll talk about a bill being referred for a third reading. That's when it's the floor vote. Once a bill passes its first house, it goes through all the same steps in the second house. If a bill is significantly amended in the second house, it returns to the original house for a second vote. And if the house House of Origin doesn't agree, there's a conference committee that works out details. So once a bill actually passes both chambers, it's sent to the governor's desk. He signs or vetoes. If he doesn't sign it and he doesn't veto it, it becomes law anyway. Could I please have the next slide? As Ralph mentioned, legislative sessions in California run for 2 years. They run odd to even. And you need to know the session years, by the way, when you're looking up a bill, because bill numbers are reused. So AB 284 for the 21-22 legislative session is not the same bill as AB 284 in the 2019-2020 session. And each year has its own timeline. What you see before you is the timeline for 2022. And timelines in odd years run January through October, but in even years, they run January through August to give people time to go out and campaign for their own reelection. So August of the second year is a sprint of activity. I'm not looking forward to August 1st, truthfully. Notice all bills have to pass out of their fiscal committee by August 12th. If they don't pass out, they're dead. August 25th is the last day to amend bills that are on the floor, and all bills have to pass both houses by August 31st. September 30th is the last day for a governor to sign or veto bills, and action can be taken during that time period. Next slide, please. Want to review a little bit about the executive branch, the governor's office. As everybody knows, the governor signs and vetoes bills, but they also propose the state budget. They can propose legislation. They also take significant action through executive orders. Ralph mentioned one of those. Some other very important executive orders. In September 2020, Newsom issued an order that requires all new cars and passenger trucks sold in California to be zero emissions by 2035. In October 2020, he launched the 30 by 30 initiative, which sets a goal to conserve 30% of the state's land and coastal waters by 2030. Very important. Ralph also mentioned that they try to get elements, if not all of the executive orders codified into law, because executive orders can be overturned. It's harder to overturn laws, obviously. And part of the 30 by 30 order, the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, was actually codified into law via SB 27 last year. Finally, and most importantly, the Governor's Office oversees all state agencies. Next slide, please. State agencies implement and enforce laws. And as you all know, they have a tremendous amount of power, because once a bill, the devil is in the details, and the details are in the regulations. In the climate arena, some of the key regulatory agencies, now there I think are over 130 agencies, it's probably a larger number, but some of the key agencies we work with on a consistent basis: CARB, California Air Resources Board. They oversee air pollution regulations. They run the cap and trade program, clean vehicle. They also look at environmental justice for at-risk communities. CARB is also responsible for a critical document known as the scoping plan. This plan is California's guide towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state and achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. A new scoping plan is due this year. It's highly problematic. There's a lot of pushback from environmental justice groups over the draft. And the next meeting of the CARB board is in September. If people are interested, certainly something to focus on. Another major important regulatory agency, CPUC. As many of you know and probably are involved, there's an incredible initiative regarding net metering and rooftop solar under consideration at this very moment. And finally, there's CalGEM. CalGEM issues permits for oil and gas wells. So you can imagine we're involved with them. Currently, CalGEM's reviewing a proposed rule to establish a 3,200-foot buffer zone between oil gas well extraction, homes, schools, businesses, and health facilities. This rule would only apply to new wells. So a number of groups, environmental, climate, environmental justice, are advocating that the rule be expanded to include old and idle wells as well. This is particularly important to those of us residing in Contra Costa. So I'm now going to turn this over to Kathy to talk about lobbying lawmakers.
I mentioned before how we meet with the legislators and how we try to do that a couple of times in each legislative session. Some legislators are very easy to get in touch with. Others we have a difficult time setting up meetings with. It's a great way for us to show that they have constituents in their district in a lot of because different organizations join us. And we are fighting huge moneyed interests. I mean, we're the grassroots. Big Oil in California spent $8 million in 2020. And when you go to look at, there are different ways you can see what legislators have accepted money from these groups, and so you can get a sense about who they're funding. And the California Democratic Party, while individual legislators can say, no, we're not going to take fossil fuel money, did not act on the no fossil fuel money pledge in 2021. I think as the party, they said they wouldn't take money, but not for the individuals. And you want to go ahead to the next slide? So as Ralph mentioned, ledge info is very important. When we're meeting, we generally talk about 3 or 4 bills. We usually only have about a half an hour. Sometimes we'll have an hour, but half an hour, and we've got one coming up with Dodd that's only going to be 15 minutes. So you have to focus on certain things. You can't talk about, the 30 bills we've endorsed. You're just we usually have 3 or 4 bills in the House and 3 or 4 bills in the Senate that we're really focusing on. And we pick those bills because we think they might be having trouble. So we're not going to lobby on a bill that pretty much everyone's going to vote for. We're going to lobby on bills that we need to push and that are having some difficulty getting through the process. So, you know, you can look up those bills. When we have people meet, we provide a lot of the information about the bill itself. And then it's good, as I mentioned it before, to research the legislator. It's really important to know what committees they're on, because if you've got a bill that's going to be coming up in a committee and you're in an area where the legislator is on that committee, that's like a really nice time to talk to them specifically about that bill, because they can help push it through. What are they interested in? What are their positions on climate change? How do they rate on different scorecards? The Sierra Club has a scorecard. California environmental voters have a scorecard. And as I mentioned before, not all Bay Area legislators necessarily are great on these. Some of them are wonderful, some are pretty bad. And what are they interested in? So, you know, if they're interested in one particular area, you know, you want to talk about how that bill might affect it or might promote also their area of interest. We had a meeting last week with a legislator who's very interested in housing, and she asked one question about one of our bills on EV requiring chargers in multi-unit buildings. That was, you know, pretty, you know, she was sort of aware, well, how's it going to affect this? How's it going to affect these other bills? So, you know, if you don't know questions, we got back to her. You know, we contacted the author. We said, we've got a specific question, and then we emailed her the answer. So we do follow up also. Okay, go ahead with the next slide. So who do we have participate in the meetings? Constituents are the best. So you really try to get people from their district. We try to involve a variety of groups. And lots of times it's friends that you know who are involved, who are concerned about climate change. Most of us have connections with people who are in a lot of different groups. I am in the process now of making sure we sort of have a list of people who want to participate in these meetings. We often get very short notice when we're going to be meeting, and so it's nice to have a list already that we can just email out. So a variety of groups participate, and really the more the better, because it helps to show that, you know, climate change is not some kind of little wonky environmental issue. This is something that a lot of people are concerned about. And as I said, we're only talking usually about 3 or 4 bills. So sometimes people don't feel comfortable talking about a bill, but just their presence is important. And that can help show that there's support for these things. So pretty much anybody who's in support of our issues can attend, and all the better if they're representing a bigger organization. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. So how do we get ready for these meetings? We have, you know, because we've been doing this now for a while, we basically have a form agenda that we can send out to our legislative lead. Each district has a person in charge of setting up these meetings, gathering the people who are going to meet, contacting the legislator, and having an agenda. So we have pre-made agendas, and we can plug the bills in, and we usually send a very abbreviated version to the office staff, but we always want to send a copy, the agenda that lists the bills and some fact sheets. And that way they know what we're going to be talking about. And that way, if they have specific questions about a bill, you know, they're prepared. And some people are more prepared than others, but part of these meetings are to get feedback from people and to answer their questions. And then we have a longer agenda that we give to the people who are going to be going to the meetings that has much more detailed information about all the bills, so that it's almost like a script, so that they can just, you know, read off of it, read the fact sheets, be prepared to answer a few questions. And then we have a prep meeting before the meeting, and we assign roles. We'll have somebody introduce 350 Bay Area Action. We'll make sure we know who's going to speak about each bill, someone to take notes, someone to sort of track the time. It's important to track the time because, again, a half-an-hour meeting just goes by so quickly. And then we always like to take a screenshot or a picture. I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are some pictures of meeting with legislators prior to COVID. So, and this was when we would meet in their office, often the district offices. Next slide. These are meetings once we switched over to Zoom, and most legislators are still doing Zoom meetings, and for Zoom meetings are actually really convenient because people don't have to drive to the office. But I don't know how long they'll continue doing that. I know right now up in Sacramento, it can be a little difficult to meet in person. Okay, and next slide. So after the meeting, we follow up with a thank you. If they've had specific questions about a bill, we'll answer that, or sometimes we'll even get those answers to them quicker. And I think they really appreciate it. I had the experience this spring where we were really pushing legislators to do one specific sign-on letter. And then there's one piece of legislation we were pushing, and it did not pass. But in our district, you know, a couple of the legislators voted for it, and I called them up to thank them for voting that way, even though it didn't pass. And they were so appreciative, you know, so we don't always do personal phone calls, but on this one we did. And I can't tell you, they really sounded happy for somebody to be calling them to say thank you, because I'm sure most of the time people are calling them to ask for something. And so that was good. Okay, Mary Ruth, she's gonna wrap it up. You're muted too.
Okay, here's our communications team. It really relies on the action teams for information, both about the key, you know, why is this bill important? How does it affect climate? So that we can craft messages. You know, some of the messages go to our entire 19 to 20,000 members, and some of them are very targeted. So this year, we really targeted on specific bills. We have the capacity in our database to identify what legislative districts people are in. So we targeted our folks with a very specific message for them to send to their legislators. And that seems to be one of the most effective ways. And then we have a newsletter. We try to keep everyone apprised. You know, we just sent a newsletter last week or the week before, right after all the bills either passed or didn't pass their committees. And so, you know, keeping people up to date on what's going on with the legislation that we've endorsed. We are looking to expand our capacity in the future with social media. So we do post things on social media, but we are looking to basically target bills, specific bills. We haven't done all that much of that, but we're planning to expand that. So next slide. This is a thank you to you. Thank you for coming. And I just want to say that these represent, you saw a lot of pictures about legislative visits, but we also promote and attend various other demonstrations and protests and sit-ins and lie-ins and die-ins and that kind of thing. And we partner with other organizations who organize some of these, and we encourage our folks to get to them. And the last slide is Q&A. So I think we can take the slide down. We can stop sharing so that we can look at people. And
Great. Thank you
Yes.
so much, Mary Ruth, Kathy, Valerie, and Ralph. That was, first of all, that was a lot of information to digest, particularly for folks who are first timers to a lot of this. But hey, we're gonna be working it through when we go into the second part of our our meeting, putting some of this into action. So I think it's going to make more sense at that time. Before we get to questions, I just want to let folks know that we have put together a form, an interest form for people who are interested in joining in some of these meetings with legislators. Audrey's going to put a link to the form in the chat. The form is going to be private, so it's not like we're going to share all your information with people, but we are going to compile a list of where you are, where your districts are, and when there are meetings that come up with your legislators, then it'll be a list where you can be invited to join if you are so interested. And I just want to reiterate that if you haven't done this before, you can go on these meetings and you don't have to say a word. It's if you come and you're just a face and a constituent, that's going to mean everything. But eventually, you can gain confidence to be more of an active part of that. So with that said, we've got some questions in the chat, and Audrey was kind enough to kind of keep track of those. Also, if there are folks that have questions and want to ask them live, feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand, if you don't mind. Why don't we?
Okay, thank you. That's great. So Audrey, I do want to add one thing that I'm not sure we've made it clear how much fun doing this is. That it's fun, and the relationships that you build with your fellow team members they're close and they're committed, and it can be exciting. Last minute things that happen, and all of a sudden we got to get on this, and we got to, So anyway, I'm not sure. I mean, we were really focused on getting information out, but the feel of doing this work is very, very much fun. It can be hard work, but you've got backup. You've got your team leads who are very supportive of whatever you're doing. And you don't have to start out doing everything. Okay. So Audrey.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing. There's really a sense of accomplishment when we had an experience last year where with one of our particular legislators, in the committee, he voted against something that we really needed to pass. We talked to him, we lobbied him. When it came to the floor vote, he didn't actually vote for it, but he did not vote. And that was an accomplishment. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I think maybe we helped save this bill. So, we had specifically talked to him about it. So or I don't know if we'd talked to him, but we had targeted his district. So I think that, you can see results sometimes with these. And just as I mentioned, if you can alleviate a legislator's concern about one part of a bill, or relay to, the author that this is a concern, that can help get bills passed.
Cool. Okay, Audrey, question number one.
Yeah, there are just a couple of questions in the chat, but I'm going to start with one of my own, which is, it seems to me that meeting over Zoom, meeting remotely has a great democratizing effect. That meeting in person is a high barrier for a lot of people. It's expensive, it's time consuming. And I wonder if there is a push sort of on the climate justice, from the climate justice angle of maintaining the ability to do public comment remotely, or to promote having these meetings remotely. And I wondered if you guys had any insight into that.
Valerie, you want to take this one, or Kathy?
Let me start and then Kathy jump in. There is a lot of push by not just EJ community, great point, Audrey, but in general, to keep not only the Zoom call-ins, but the Zoom, the teleconferencing. And the Senate seems to have heard it, as I said, but I think what might be useful if people contacted their assembly member and let them know. I think lobbying for it's important. Because some committees just cut it off completely, and the chairs don't care. So we may need more of a grassroots lobbying effort. Kathy?
Yeah, I would say with our district meetings, I haven't heard much about the legislators saying, yeah, we want to meet with you in person. At least not at this time. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and sometimes it's convenient for them because occasionally they'll take a meeting when they're not in their office. And of course, it's very convenient for us because, you know, when we used to meet in person, that would often involve a couple of hours because you'd have to drive to the district office, you know, you'd meet with them, you'd have to drive home. Where the Zoom, you know, you just click on and click off. It's a half hour, an hour of your time with the prep meeting. But I haven't heard anything from people saying, hey, they want to meet us in person. So
Yeah.
I have a feeling they might be content to continue by Zoom.
Yeah, I think it's a great, I think it, as in the comments here, you know, it makes it more available to people.
Yeah, you don't have to
Promote
take half
keeping
a day off work.
Alice Sung had a couple of questions, and one had come up in a meeting I had recently about introducing legislation. And so, excuse me. And Alice, do you want to ask your question? She can't be on camera right now, so but she's here. Can you be on speaker, or oh, maybe not. But she asked about regarding policy, if we have some ideas for bills that should be proposed or actions that we would like to see incorporated into other bills, how do you suggest that being proposed to legislators? I guess I would add, is there an effective way of researching if some of those ideas are already in action? And Alice asks, do we have a successful model for doing that? Do you have any examples of policy that you have initiated or proposed?
There are climate groups that do write and propose legislation. It's for 350 Bay Area Action. It's on our to-do list. We are constantly trying to expand our capacity and our reach. But we don't do that yet. I think the Climate Center is a good example of that. There are certain limitations to being an all-volunteer organization, I have to say, in terms of being able to actually write legislation and sponsor it. So Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah,
and then Valerie.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mary Ruth, as an example, one of the I guess committees, I guess for want of a better word, that I work with within 350 Bay Area is with a team called the Transmission Access Charges Reform Meeting. Without getting into the weeds of what that issue is, basically it relates to charges that customers receive that relate to transmission, moving electricity over transmission wires to get it to where you want to use it. And it's in the context of distributed energy resources and designing rates in a manner that make implementation of distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, PV, battery storage, et cetera, provide incentives. And the TAC reform team has actually worked with some folks in the legislature to come up with a draft bill that the TAC reform team is trying to sell to get a legislator to sponsor. So that's an example. There is a subcommittee of a specific issue that's very complicated, but there have been efforts ongoing for like 3 sessions. Most recently, Mary Ruth mentioned the Climate Center, and the Climate Center is one of the groups that in the last couple of sessions has actually sponsored a couple bills, one of which has been Dodd's that we've supported. So the Climate Center is a group that's sponsored in the TAC reform team that I'm working on within 350 Bay Area is talking with the Climate Center and trying to talk to them about whether this would be the type of bill they might want to adopt for the next session. And that's up to them, of course, but that's an example of a model perhaps that could be utilized.
So in that case, you think it's more effective to go, rather than taking something to a legislator, to take something to an organization that is a little more equipped to do something like this, to take an idea to the climate center and see if they might develop it and.
Only because a group like the Climate Center, if they choose to sponsor a bill, they got the resources to
Right.
follow through with it. But the another alternative is to put together a 1 or 2 page bullet points of the issue you want to get a bill on, and put together why, and this is what it could look, these are the main points, and take it to your local legislator. And if he or she isn't, if that's not an issue he or she is interested in, then they can perhaps suggest a legislator that you could talk to using your legislator as a way of getting into the door. So that is an alternative as well, but puts a little more burden on your end to put together the bullets and the explanation as to why you want it.
So Valerie.
Lower hand.
Yeah.
I was going to talk about another example, not of introducing a bill, but when there's a bill already in play and you're a little concerned about the language, this is where having a relationship with a legislator helps, but you don't have to. But they may be more inclined to listen to you if they feel that they can trust you. And so last session with Senator Skinner, there was a bill that they had introduced, she had introduced, and we were concerned there were not sufficient guardrails around public health and safety. This had to do with carbon sequestration. And we wrote her and said, we're very concerned, there are not enough guardrails. And they wrote back and said, give us some language. And we literally proposed a paragraph. We also let our allies know we were doing it. So they got similar language from several sources, and she incorporated the language.